Ladies and gentlemen, please now welcome to the stage lecturer in international relations at Leicester University, Blevin Bowen.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk to you today about outer space and what it means in the military context, given that NATO is about to officially declare outer space as a new operational domain for the alliance. What I'm going to do is hopefully give you some meaningful context as to what that means, and also portray an accurate picture of the realities of military operations in outer space. And we'll hopefully touch on the issue of weaponization as well, which is never far away in media commentary on this issue, and something you'll probably hear a lot about in the news in the weeks ahead. NATO is about to declare outer space as an operating domain for the military. And this essentially brings NATO up to speed with what some of the larger member states of NATO have in practice done for decades, and in the case of Britain and France have put into writing in more recent years. So the United States Air Force has been talking about space as a military domain or an operational domain since the 1980s, the early 1980s. And Britain and France have recently followed suit. Britain has seen a lot of activity with new space doctrines and new policies and space security policies being published as well. And what this means essentially is that there's a recognition now in the NATO alliance formally that space is essential for military operations and for tactical and operational uses of military power. So rather than just strategic uses of space technology for slow burn intelligence, imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, it is now useful on the battlefield. And this is not new. Space being arguably decisive on the battlefield or essential goes back in the United States to at least the 1991 Gulf War. So this is a formal recognition really within NATO that space is essential for warfare, and therefore in a time of war, it is not unreasonable to expect those space systems to come under some form of attack or denial or disruption because of their utility in military operations. So one of the words that's bandied about in talking about outer space and military issues is space militarization. Indeed, one of the questions I got for this talk, or the prompts, was, should space be militarized? And that's like trying to close the barn door after the horse has bolted. Space began as a military realm. If it wasn't for the military applications of ICBMs and rockets to deliver nuclear weapons and to deploy spy satellites and communication satellites for military purposes, we would not have seen the massive amounts of investment in space technologies in the 1950s and 60s in the superpowers of the Cold War, and also amongst other European states and other countries like China and India as well. So space has always been a military realm. So talking about whether space is being militarized is something of a misconception, really. So we shouldn't be too alarmist about these sorts of declarations, because space began as a military environment. It's always been an environment that has been used primarily for military purposes. And scientific and commercial exploitation of space is something that has come after the initial military and intelligence exploitations of space. So space has always been a military realm. Weaponization then, in some of the initial press releases already, it seems NATO has had to say there are no plans to weaponize space. And one of the realities is that to engage in space warfare, you don't need to put weapons in space. So if you are afraid that putting weapons in space will allow space warfare to happen, you're missing the real fact, the strategic reality that you can engage in forms of space warfare with weapon systems that are based on Earth and not always those that are based in orbit. So anti-satellite weapon systems are proliferating. The United States, China, Russia, and India all have kinetic or physical anti-satellite weapon systems program. Russia, I believe, is still the only one that hasn't tested one in recent years. But there are many other forms of attacking space infrastructure that are so-called soft kill mechanisms like electronic warfare or computer network operations or computer network infiltration, what is fashionably called cyber. So there are many other ways of doing space system attacks, and they can happen on the ground, or they can happen with systems that are based on Earth that point up into space. So worrying about space weaponization has to be put in the context that we can wage space warfare now, at least from the perspective of the major powers of the international system, without putting weapons in space. So with that background, essentially my understanding of NATO now getting more interested in space as an operating domain means NATO has to figure out what its member states can do to better integrate and coordinate the rather disparate space capabilities of especially the European member states. There's a lot of complementarity in some member states. Different member states have different kinds of sovereign space capabilities in military satellite communications, intelligence capabilities, and various other space services as well. So NATO does have a role in trying to figure out where can spending be better allocated amongst its member states to try and combine the total space power assets that are within the NATO alliance, because put together, NATO has by far the highest number of space systems available. So a good chunk of those over 2,000 active satellites that are now in space are owned by or registered in NATO member states. So there's a lot of thinking to be done there with NATO as to what it can do to better align those disparate European member states' capabilities in space. So I will leave my comments there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I think we have time for just to probe you on one point. How difficult is attribution in space? This is something we've spent a lot of time wondering about in hybrid scenarios. What do little green men look like in space?
Yes, good question. So if it's a big hard kill weapon system event, so if it's a ramming vehicle that is shot up into space, that is quite easy to attribute. Things like cyber attacks or computer network operations, they are harder as any form of cyber attack would be. So the fact that it's going into a satellite control system doesn't change the fact that it can be hard to attribute. Electronic warfare, a lot of that happens unintentionally every day as normal operations within the radio frequency spectrum, unless it's very high-powered jamming, and the longer it goes on, the easier it becomes to identify and track it as well. But things at the beginning of a crisis with soft kill methods can be harder to attribute, but a big, spectacular hard kill incident should be fairly easy to attribute thanks to physics.
Do you think we have sufficient rules of the road in understanding of each other's thresholds in avoiding escalation in this domain?
I would say no, but space is not unique in that regard. So we're not particularly clear on how people would react or should react with terrestrial incidents, so why should space be any different?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Glenn.